A new study found that government spending during the COVID pandemic was, quote, primarily responsible for the 2021-22 inflation surge.
The Ontario branch of CUPE, a public sector union, released an action plan which focused on more socialist revolutionary ideas than bread and butter union issues, such as improving wages and working conditions.
A 14-year-old boy is wanted by police after a 70-year-old woman was fatally stabbed during a suspected robbery in Ontario. Hello Canada, it's Monday, July 21st, and this is the True North Daily Brief. I'm Isaac Lamoureux.
And I'm Walid Tamtam.
We've got you covered with all the news you need to know. Let's discuss the top stories of the day and the True North exclusives you won't hear anywhere else. A new study claims the Liberal government's reckless spending during COVID was, quote, primarily responsible for the 2021-22 inflation surge, arguing the Bank of Canada was largely powerless to stop it. Two economists at the C.D. Howe Institute published their findings on Thursday, which criticized the Trudeau government's massive, quote, helicopter drops of funding into the private sector. According to the study, money doled out during the pandemic via government programs totaled an estimated $270 billion, or roughly 12.5% of Canada's gross domestic product. That money has since grown to about $360 billion. The report said, quote, whether this wealth takes the form of new money or new debt is largely irrelevant. While inflation remained subdued in 2020 as the full impact of the COVID-19 pandemic hit Canada, it began to accelerate suddenly in the spring of 2021, breaking through the bank's control range in April. It said, quote, the acceleration continued more or less steadily until the summer of 2022, after reaching a peak of 8.1% in June 2022. Prices jumped 11.4% between January 2020 and December 2022, with gasoline being one of the hardest hit commodities, increasing by more than 50% over that period. Food and transportation also saw an increase of between 15 and 20%, while appliances and rent went up 10 and 15% respectively. However, prices have remained high in the years that have followed. So, Walid, we hear a lot of explanations for inflation from various competing political views and groups, but is the revelation that government spending was the leading cause of inflation surprising?
Well, no, really. It pretty much confirms what a lot of us have already suspected, that the government's COVID response was economically reckless. You mentioned the figure, $270 billion pumped directly into the private sector. No real long-term guardrails. It's no surprise that it cooked the economy. And now we're living with the consequences today. Prices didn't just spike and fall back down. They haven't fell back down, actually. They reset higher. That's permanent. That's what the CD House study is saying. We're on a permanent elevated price path. Groceries, rent, appliances, everything costs more, and it's staying that way. What's interesting is the study doesn't let the Bank of Canada off the hook, entirely at least. But it basically just says, look, when fiscal policy is out of control, the central bank can't mop up the floor fast enough without risking a full-on recession. So in a sense, the Trudeau government and the Liberal government didn't just trigger inflation. They triggered inflation and they boxed the bank into a corner where it could no longer solve the issue. So yeah, I think the study gives real weight, intellectual weight, data to what many Canadians already know and feel, that the cost of living crisis we're in is not just some mysterious global force. It isn't Ukraine, it's not even the US, it has Canadian fingerprints all over it, and those fingerprints belong to the Liberal government. The Ontario branch of the Canadian Union for Public Employees has released its 2025 action plan, and instead of focusing on bread and butter union issues such as working wages and conditions, it calls for partisan action, demeans conservatives, and focuses quite heavily on an anti-Israel agenda. The document often reads more like a revolutionary manifesto than a strategy to improve the working conditions of Ontario's public employees. Echoing Marxist-Leninist ideologies, it advances the notion that Canada's economy and political woes are orchestrated by a small group of elites. The plan said, quote, the disorientation is deliberate, manufactured by billionaires, their political allies to keep us off balance, isolate us, and prevent effective resistance. Canada's struggle against corporate greed is inseparable from the struggle against imperialism and global exploitation. The union demanded a, quote, fundamental redistribution of wealth expropriated from corporations and the rich and given to the working class. The group targeted anti-free market policies, such as tariffs, as the failure of capitalism. and called fiscal conservatism, quote, class warfare waged by corporations and the elite who refuse to pay their fair share, with the aim of dismantling our public services for private profit. CUPE Ontario claimed, quote, our fight is not against trade itself, but against capitalism and the 10 corporations wielding these deals as weapons, often used to impose crushing austerity on the global south. The union mentioned the need for militant, worker-led initiatives and organizing 3 times in the plan. CUPE Ontario did not respond to Trudeau's request for clarification or comment. So question for you, Isaac. How did the unions get to this point? Have they always been vehicles for socialist activism?
Yeah, tough question, Walid. Ontario's largest public sector union released their new strategic blueprint for 2025 that shifts its priorities toward aggressive political activism and international advocacy campaigns. CUPE's Ontario division outlines a broad range of objectives in the document, many of which depart from traditional labor-focused concerns. Instead of centering on employment standards or bargaining issues, the plan emphasizes confrontational tactics, ideological messaging, and controversial geopolitical positions. Among the themes advanced in the document are the rejection of market-based economic models, the endorsement of wealth seizure from affluent entities, and the promotion of grassroots organizing tactics framed as large-scale confrontations. The union outlines plans to cultivate a long-term network of activist engagement capable of escalating political pressure through coordinated mobilization. The publication also singles out right-leaning groups and politicians as targets of opposition and ties modern media and artificial intelligence tools to the growth of those political movements. It warns against what it calls reactionary coalitions, which the union says must be challenged by counter-movements rooted in progressive ideology. In addition to domestic political aims, the document dedicates a substantial portion of its content to foreign policy concerns, particularly surrounding the Middle East. The plan supports advocacy aligned with Palestinian political movements and criticizes definitions of anti-Semitism that have been adopted by several Western governments. The union aligns itself with alternative frameworks that it says are better suited to address perceived forms of prejudice in the ongoing Israel-Palestine discourse. Jewish community organizations have raised concerns about the balance of the union's approach. According to representatives from B'nai B'rith Canada, the organization's positions risk downplaying contemporary manifestations of anti-Semitism and appear inconsistent with existing definitions that are designed to protect minority rights globally. The action plan also includes calls to reframe equity policies within the union itself, acknowledging the limitations of existing diversity practices and calling for broader inclusion based on personal identity markers. Despite its expansive scope, the document makes only limited reference to direct improvements in members' working environments or compensation structures. Critics argue that the union's focus may no longer reflect the immediate needs of public employees across the province. While organized labor in Canada has historically included elements of left-leaning advocacy, documents like CUPE Ontario's 2025 plan illustrate how some unions have evolved into broader political actors, prioritizing ideological campaigns and global activism over collective bargaining. This shift reflects a decades-long trend in parts of the labor movement, where workplace representation is increasingly fused with social justice and anti-capitalist objectives. Police are searching for a 14-year-old male who is wanted after allegedly stabbing a 71-year-old woman to death in North York on Thursday. During a news conference on Friday, homicide investigators identified the teenage suspect as Kamani Wint and released his photo. Due to provisions in the Criminal Code and Young Offenders Act, it is extremely rare and unusual for police to release the name and picture of a suspect still considered a minor. However, in this case, Detective Matthew Pinfold said police were able to obtain judicial authorization to identify Wint, as he is on the run and considered to be dangerous. Wint is wanted for second-degree murder in the stabbing death of Shanaz Pistonji.
Since the homicide, police have conducted an extensive and urgent search. We've been canvassing door to door, using K9 units and drones, as well as reviewing surveillance footage in the area, as well as from transit through the TTC.
According to police, the 71-year-old was loading groceries into her car in the parking lot of a commercial plaza on Parkway Forest Drive, south of Shepherd Avenue East, when she was attacked and stabbed. Pistonji was transported to the hospital but succumbed to her injuries and died. Pinfold noted, quote, Through reviewing the video surveillance, speaking with witnesses, and observing the person's movement prior to the attack, we believe that the person intended to rob Miss Pistongi. Toronto police have speculated it was, quote, a robbery that escalated into attack. The suspect remains at large and is believed to be using public transit to travel throughout the city, he added. So, Walid, is Toronto getting less safe? How has crime gotten worse in the city since 10 years ago?
Well, first of all, an update on this case. Toronto police have now arrested the suspect. The accused is underage, therefore his name and image have been removed from our coverage and other coverage in the media in order to comply with the Youth Criminal Justice Act. This, for me, really mirrors a situation that also happened in the GTA area. I believe it was in Durham, where in June, a 14-year-old male was charged with first-degree murder of 83-year-old Eleanor Donny, and of course, that's also shocked the community over there. So whether the numbers suggest a steady increase from 2016, I believe there has been an increase of the overall amount of homicides that have happened since 2016. So 75 homicides happened in 2016. 2024, that number is now 86. For the last couple of years, that has always been above 79. So it is a concerning trend where more and more victims are being caught in these armed robberies, in these attempted robbery situations, as old, as are elderly, and as vulnerable as they are, and involving perpetrators that are minors, and very often the case, unfortunately. So I do believe not only Toronto, but many major cities in the country have seen a spike in crime, but unfortunately Toronto has seen a spike in violent crime, and specifically in the summer season, we've seen a spike in crime involving youth against our seniors. So perhaps a generational trauma that is really shocking our communities, unfortunately.
That's it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. You can stay on top of new episodes every weekday by subscribing to the Daily Brief on iTunes and Spotify. Also, while you're at it, make sure to hit us with a 5-star rating and please leave a review.